First, Ellis Furman. Ellis is a PhD candidate and Vanier Canada Scholar in Community Psychology at Wilfrid Laurier University. Ellis uses qualitative, quantitative, and arts-informed research methods to amplify the voices of queer and trans communities through community-based research, program evaluation, and knowledge mobilization. Vivila is a researcher and sex educator who is dedicated to promoting holistic sexual health for diverse communities and empowering 2SLGBTQ+ individuals by providing culturally appropriate sex education. Viv is a master's student in community psychology at Wilfrid Laurier University and holds a BA in psychology from Western University. Welcome back, Viv. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters.
All right. Okay. All right, everyone, thank you so much all getting here today. And we're so excited to have our webinar today. And my name is Vivila, and you can call me Viv. And we're so glad to talk about our study and everything today. And so as Linda, thank you for introducing us. And I'm a sex educator and community-based researcher, and Alice is also a community-based researcher and also a PhD student, a PhD candidate, sorry, pardon me.
My mic is working now. Sorry about that.
Your mic was not working.
Yeah. Sorry. Keep going, Viv.
Yeah, so we hope everyone today can get what you need for your organization, and hopefully our webinar, our contents can give you a new framework to work on all the great things you're working on right now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Linda, for the introduction. We're both really excited to be here, and this is our first time doing a webinar. So while we're really familiar with doing education in online and digital formats, this is our first time doing a webinar, so we're really excited. And we're gonna get right into it.
So why are we even here? As we have in this webinar's title, we are all here today to talk about how can we improving the pathway to safety for all the 2SLGBTQ+ survivors of violence. And this is not a training again. So you might think, oh, this is just another thing my organization sent me to, blah, blah, all those things, but it's not a training. Honestly, it's just a call of action. We're all here to share what we know about the very real and current state of how queer, trans, and two-spirit and non-binary people are being excluded or silenced in accessing violence-related support. So we want to share this with you, this webinar, so we can all determine what can we do better and focus on our strengths we already have and overcome all the barriers we have. So we all appreciate everyone showed up today, and we understand everyone come from a really different background and experiences. They are all valuable. Therefore, we will talk about the context and the language we use first to make sure we all use the same language, we all understand what each other trying to talk about by each term. And then we will go ahead to talk about our research project about violence against women agencies, their strengths, and also barriers in terms of providing services to LGBTQ+ survivors. And then we will describe the overall findings to outline the recommendations for understanding how we can work together to support LGBTQ+ survivors in accessing what they need to promote their safety, health, and also wellness.
Perfect.
In the end, we will talk about the thinking process before we even do any action to make the change happen. And then we will have some recommendations for everyone to work on for your own organization.
So just to start off with some of the context, as Viv mentioned, it's really hard to talk about this without having a common understanding of the language or terminology we're using. And language is obviously something that constantly changes depending on the context. So while something might be appropriate language right now, it might not be in the future or like that forever. So our main goal is to use language intentionally and explain why we're using the language that we're using, because we just feel like that maybe is the best method for us. So we're gonna go straight into some terminology, and Viv is gonna start us off with our favorite acronym.
Yeah, so in our title, there's an acronym 2SLGBTQ+. So what are they even? Let's break it down one by one. The first two S is actually one term, stands for two-spirit, and then L stands for lesbian, G for gay, B for bisexual, T for transgender, Q for queer, and there is also a plus sign in the end to include anyone who may now use the word we have in the beginning, but they also identify as members in this community.
And oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, typically the acronym is used just to encompass any possible identity. So as Viv said, there's lots that aren't mentioned, but because of this, we try not, at least Viv and I are trying not to use the acronym for all of our work because it doesn't really show all of the experiences that we're trying to explain. So instead,
yeah, we need to know why those acronyms even come from. It's all going back to the gender and also sexual orientation. We all know gender is something identity. It might tie to your biology, and also it tied to like what kind of identity you actually identify with. Well, for example, for myself, like you might think I'm a female, and actually I'm a female. I identify as a female. I was born as a female, and my gender expression, I wear my earrings, I have my long hair, and it's a typical female right here. So I'm also cisgender, so because my biology, my self-identification, and my feeling all fit into the female category. So this is how gender can be unpacked into different pieces right here. And mostly in our society today, we use a binary gender system, which means they're gonna be female and male, men and women. That's a binary system. But also today, because all the diversity is happening right now, and we have people, they identify with identity that is way go beyond the binary system. And another important part of having all those terms we just talked about is about the sexual orientation. This is the identity people identify with. This can be break down into your behavior and also your attraction. Behavior can be having a romantic relationship or just simply having some sexual behavior. You have certain orientation of certain gender or certain type of people you wish to have intimate contact or intimate relationship with. However, another thing can be attached with behavior or detached with behavior completely. That's attraction. So I can have some sexual attraction toward any gender, but I might only interested being a romantic relationship with men with one gender. That's totally possible and totally normal. And some people may have consistent attraction for romantic and sexual behavior. That's also totally okay. And those two things, gender and sexual orientation altogether, explain why this is a really complex topic we are trying to unpack here.
Exactly. And so just to reiterate, like the reason why we are organizing it that way is because to us, this makes a bit more sense, these broader categories of understanding things in terms of gender and then the complexity there, sexual orientation, and then the different components of that, instead of reducing it just to this acronym, because that doesn't tell us that much. Yes, it's honoring people's identities, but it's not telling us exactly what we need to know about what the identities actually mean. So when you use this framework of understanding it through gender and sexual orientation, we can see different combinations of how that works together. So the key terms that we like using, specifically like myself and Viv, is being intentional about the larger categories and how they are representative of gender and sexual diversity. So to start off, one key term that we want to start is with two-spirit, and my apologies, we didn't get to start with our land acknowledgement because of my mic issues, but in doing this work, first of all, it's interesting to do a land acknowledgement digitally, but the whole point is I want to be really intentional in linking the work that we're doing now to past and current forms of colonization that are the undercurrent and root of all forms of violence that we experience. So we can't talk about violence without talking about colonization. And in talking about colonization, two-spirit identities are sexual and or gender identities that are specific to the Indigenous worldview that look different across nations. So while it is often tacked on as an identity through our LGBTQ2S acronym, we've been really trying to understand how we use the acronym by placing two-spirit at the beginning, because we want to center those experiences. And by centering those experiences, I mean actually doing it intentionally. So I would say two-spirit is often an identity that gets tacked on, not really understood. So in doing this work, trying to better understand what that means is important. Do you want to do queer?
So, and also I saw in the Q&A box, there's one person mentioning about two-spirit. Like people sometimes try to dissociate two-spirit with LGBTQ, all those things. And for today's webinar, and in the acronym, because we put two-spirit in the beginning of the acronym, it's part of the reason why is that we wanna to remind people this is also a really colonial context we are talking about here. And two-spirit is also really specific to the culture context. So it's specific to the Indigenous worldview, which means if you're now coming from the Indigenous world, this is probably not identity you will be identified with, because this is not from your culture, from your background. Mm-hmm. And another word here we mentioned is queer. This is an umbrella term for all the sexual and gender minorities who are now heterosexual or are now cisgender. So queer is also a word in the past being used in a really harmful way, but today we decided to embrace this word and take it, reclaim it. It's part of the power move of the queer community trying to do here. And the next word is transgender, and this is an umbrella term for people who whose gender identity or gender expression or their behavior does not consistent with the birth gender they were being assigned when they are just at birth.
Right. So what this means is that if at birth or whatever, when you're assigned a gender, this means you just don't identify with that gender later on or at some point in your life. So for example, when I was born, I was assigned female at birth, and I don't identify as a woman. I identify as somewhere along a masculine spectrum of gender, because we know that gender is more complex than what it seems. And for those who have this experience, this is just a general term. So we're going to be using the word transgender or trans interchangeably. And there's no way of being trans that is correct. It can encompass forms of social transition where you're changing your name or using different pronouns, talking to people about your gender. It can be medical, going on hormones, getting surgery, but it can also be none of those things or any of those things, just picking what you want from your trans toolbox. And then for non-binary, these identities we're categorizing separately because these are gender identities that are not exclusively masculine or feminine. So it's outside of the gender binary. So people either associate somewhat with different levels of masculinity or femininity, maybe not identifying with the binary at all, or somewhere in between. And being non-binary as an identity is not associated with a specific gender expression. And that's really important, which we're gonna come back to later, but there is no way of looking trans or non-binary. You can't really tell or look at those things, so it's important to understand that differentiation later on.
Yeah, part of the reason why we have today's webinar is we want to unpack all those complex relationships with identity and also the expression. And hopefully everyone by now like can try to like detach those concepts a little bit, and we will go further later.
Totally. So how did we even get here? There's a few different pieces that led us to this project in the first place. And one of those things is a lot of academic and community research that we've done. In 2015, or maybe before 2015, 2014, I did my undergraduate thesis project on inclusion in shelters for queer and trans people. And that's when I first started realizing that besides this being a problem among queer and trans communities, there's this access need for folks. So yes, we know over the past 20 years, maybe more than that, research has showed that queer and trans people, people within the LGBTQ2S communities experience higher rates of violence than those who are heterosexual and cisgender. So violence and harm looks a little bit different in these situations sometimes because everything is rooted in power and control, but we see that it manifests differently based on people's identity facets. And there's those extra complexities of homophobia and transphobia and how those operate within the context of a relationship and queerness. So we saw that research is saying all these things. We see that violence exists. We see that, yes, violence exists in queer communities. What is being done? Well, it's really difficult to access services if you're queer or trans. The research says that, and it says that services and agencies and practitioners doing this work are not really at a place right now where they can accommodate those queer and trans clients. So we see that in research and nonprofit sector, these kind of themes are aligning. And while the research is pointing to more trainings and more work to be done in this area, we're not seeing a lot of collaboration. So let's go to Open Minds, Open Doors, which is a report that was written by the network, LARED, in 2010, so that's 10 years ago. And when I've asked people at conferences before if they are aware of this document, a lot of people say no, for the majority say no. And this is a document that we've referenced at the end, so you can go take a look, but it details processes of organizational change from envisioning what your organization can look like at different levels of queer and trans inclusion. And on the ground, we've also seen a large community need for services. We know people are experiencing violence. We know that there's no place for them to go. So what we have to do is create spaces that feel safe and allow people to feel valid and have their needs met in a way that they can heal. So that's kind of how we got here. And this is a good way to get into our project summary, which is now, this is a project that we started last year. And this was after all of the work, since we knew that shelters and agencies have not been that inclusive, at least in Ontario, for queer and trans survivors of violence, we wanted to understand what about the shelters, like what was actually creating that problem and what were the actual sticky points. So we sought to understand what are agencies' strengths and barriers in serving 2SLGBTQ survivors, and then what are the target areas that agencies need support in to strengthen and improve their service provisions. So we wanted to see what people are doing well, what folks needed improvement on, and what are those points of intervention that we can actually work with. So in this project, this was conducted by myself and two individuals through Springtide Resources, which was an organization dedicated towards ending gender-based violence. And we got ethics clearance from Wilfrid Laurier University to run this project with an advisory committee of 10 individuals who are queer, trans, two-spirit, diverse individuals with different life experiences. And all of those folks had been impacted by domestic violence in some capacity, either through their own personal experience or by supporting someone else who has experienced violence. And it's in bracket, it says initially, and that's probably a little joke for if there's any researchers in the webinar, because of course it started off with 10 folks, but eventually trickled down to only a few towards the end of the project. If you want more information on our advisory committee, feel free to contact us after, because we did a whole analysis and evaluation of that as well, because it was really integral to this project. And we also worked with 5 partner agencies that were focused on violence against women or gender-based violence scope. And these organizations are in the Greater Toronto area. So in partnership with these organizations, we sought to answer our research questions with different methods to accommodate everyone's needs. So first, we conducted an online survey for all staff, managers, board members across all agencies, because we wanted to find out in a way that was quite accessible to them, what's going on. Then we wanted to delve in a little bit more and do focus groups with individuals across organizations to kind of get a better sense and more nuanced idea of what folks were talking about in the surveys. And then while it wasn't planned to do that many interviews, we ended up doing a fair amount of interviews because folks actually felt uncomfortable speaking about their experiences in the focus group setting. So a lot of staff or managers or board members or whoever who identifies queer or trans or two-spirit participated in focus groups, but also felt like they needed to say something additional to us afterwards in the format of an interview. So we felt like this was really important to shed light on and share, because showing, using different methods to ask similar questions sometimes is useful, depending on the context, of course. And for our analysis, different types of analyses for each method. So we did some basic descriptive statistics, looking at frequencies of answers across agencies and also within agencies. So each agency got a final report that was tailored to their need, tailored to their specific data. And then we also did a composite report across sites to look at themes across everybody. Then my favorite part was the collaborative thematic analysis. So sounds intimidating maybe, but thematic analysis is a qualitative form of analysis where you're basically looking at your data, making notes or little notes to yourself of what things could be named or called, and then taking those codes, putting them together into larger thematic categories, and then kind of playing around with them to figure out what the data is trying to tell you. So what we did was a thematic analysis collaborative kind of session every week. Some of the advisory committee members and I would look at some of the transcripts from the data that we had, and then we would analyze it all together. And this was really helpful because it was more than my perspective in analyzing the data. It had diverse perspectives, interpreting, and then for our member checking session, when we were able to bring all of our findings back to the advisory committee or members who were interested in coming back to talk about the results, then it gave us a more fulsome idea of what the data was trying to tell us. So after the project and we did all of those analyses, then here today we wanted to share with you some of the main results that we think are relevant for potentially the audience. So the initial demographic information that we got from our participants, we only asked about these 3 items as well as people's positions in the organization, because we just wanted to understand, basically get a glimpse of who we were actually talking to. So not surprisingly, the majority of folks working in the sector that we interviewed or who filled out our surveys identify as cisgender women, with 8% identifying as non-binary, so not that many. And then we asked folks if they identified with any queer or trans identity, and 63% said no, 25% said yes, 12% said maybe. And then we also wanted to look at number of years working in the VAW sector to understand people's perspectives based on how entrenched they are in the sector. We also know there's a high turnover rate, so it's interesting to look at it that way, at least from my perspective. So we see that there's people with different levels of experience, but predominantly people have been in the sector, working in the sector for 1 to 9 years. So we're going to give you an overview of some of the main thematic findings that came out of the qualitative data analysis. And Viv is going to start us off, and we're going to go through, show some quotes, explain some of the findings, and hopefully it makes sense.
Yeah. So first of all, we are trying to understand what's the framework we have when we are working in the field of violence against women. So this is a perfect quote to explaining how the whole entire sector started. The shelter is culturally heavily influenced by the feminist collective history. To open the shelter to people who don't identify as women would probably require change to the mission statement, a significant shift in mindset, and also physical changes to the shelter. So our understanding here is still built on a binary gender system, which is violence against women. And we all know that in the context of patriarchy, that women all experience a lot of violence from men. We know this because all the strong women who came before us and organized different kind of actions and all the organizations, all the movements for gender equity. Women-centered and feminist grassroots activism enable the creation of space by and for women, which have been absolutely essential in terms of promoting and also maintaining women's health, safety, and survival. So why is there even the term gender-based violence? This is acknowledging the violence is also rooted in the patriarchy, and we are all here because we are in this sector, we all understand that. And it's super important to get back to the basics that this framework is built on women and men, the binary gender system.
Yeah, and that's this came out as the first theme because this is what folks were talking about across agencies. It's this idea that since we are rooted in the violence against women framework, that what goes within the framework is how we're going to practice, of course. So this sentiment was also explained that women-only spaces in the model of not working with men is a very white model, which sort of came to represent the entire VAW sector. So as Div was talking about earlier, linking this to colonialism and understanding where this idea of the gender binary comes from allows us to see that it's this worldview that is imposed through European colonization. And in referencing the Family Violence Aftercare resource booklet, which is an Indigenous resource specific to Ontario, this resource explains how violence is a byproduct of colonialism. And so in order to operate beyond this framework, we have to conceptualize violence and harm in a way that is beyond what we see through colonialism, which is like patriarchy as the root. And we need to understand that people, regardless of gender, or how you look, how you identify, people can still experience violence. And another quote that similarly talks about this framework, someone said that, I see a lot of people in the sector and they just nod and say yes, yes, and use the words trans and LGBTQ2S, but they don't really understand what's being said. And this was kind of repeated across sites as well, where there's a sense that of almost performative allyship, which is some of the terminology that folks use, where within the violence against women framework, people know that they have to be inclusive because it is feminist based and it's anti-oppressive and it's anti-racist. So everything is kind of an add-on instead of being centered on people's needs.
So from this framework, what's gonna happen when we're trying to change? Well, this quote just explain what's gonna happen. I think from the fear is where we start changing. We start challenging each other and we get a little bit less fearful to start having this really difficult and uncomfortable conversation. So everyone who's working in the field, we are all like really good people and kind people and who's trying to change the world and make it a little bit better. But what is happening is that because of this framework we had in the very beginning, it's fundamental and it's underlying everything we're trying to change, it's really difficult sometimes for us to start a conversation. And sometimes we don't even have the same language and the same understanding for the terms we use when we are trying to discussing some problem we are trying to change. So sometimes it kind of like making people feel like I don't want to offend people, so maybe I will try to avoid this conversation a little bit. And this is not really a good thing because you did avoid all the conflicts, but what is happening is that all the challenges are still there and we are not having anything down and we are just avoid the difficult and uncomfortable conversation.
Totally. And this is a visual that came from our collaborative coding sessions. And this exemplifies what Viv is just talking about, and how this, the strengths and the barriers, it's both a strength and a barrier, the violence against women framework. So we know that it is something that has created so much monumental change for women in society. And it's been so crucial to have these spaces that women can access to be safe. But we also know that this framework can be seen as a barrier when trying to expand services for people who don't identify as women, but also experience violence rooted in patriarchy and colonialism. So we see the power of narrative as a really cool pathway to kind of hold the nuance. So you have your historical framing of the violence against women sector. And because of this, this creates a culture of exclusion of queer and trans survivors. So it's not intentional, but because of the framework, that is the culture that comes from that framework. And through that culture, then you automatically have no access to support for queer or trans people who are experiencing violence, because they're not part of that story. They're not part of that narrative. And all of these barriers to systemic change, like it being difficult, not having enough funding, not having resources, not knowing what to do, those are all things that are blocking us from taking this narrative that is so powerful and kind of pivoting and saying, how can we take this and be productive with this? So I see that a lot of folks who are queer and trans have been organizing in this realm for so long, and we're kind of mirroring what has happened in the violence against women sector, and what started that movement with people literally driving around Ontario or wherever and transporting people to safe places to live, letting people stay at your house. So we've been doing that work because out of the absence of that. So when you create a framework that is beyond women potentially, or understanding a more complex understanding of gender-based violence, then it allows us to include queer and trans people in our framework, which makes it much more organic to think about inclusion and access to support. So showing the relationship between our mandate and what comes next is really exemplified here. So our mandate, policies and procedures of agencies was shown as a huge barrier among staff, and it stressed people out, frankly. People are like, there's no mandate, there's no policies, there's no procedures, we don't know what to do. And that is totally stressful. So this graph that we wanted to show you is looking at how, of the people working in these agencies, the percentage of those who are aware of inclusion policies for queer and trans survivors based on identity groups. So what we wanted to know was, is there a policy or something that allows you to serve these populations? So yes, people were aware of being able to serve cisgender women who are queer, so like lesbians, bisexual women, lesbian, bisexual women, queer women, people who are cisgender women, and then also transgender women, because that's been the conversation right now. It's moved towards anyone who identifies as a woman. So people understand that if you identify as a woman, then you should be accessing space. But there's not a lot of awareness of whether or not people who are non-binary, transgender men, or if you're a queer cisgender man, like a gay man or a bisexual man, if you're able to even access services. So go ahead, Viv.
So it's all going back to our mandates, our policy, and our procedure. So when we are having those mandates, are we really understand what are we talking about? Like, think about in the beginning, we start our conversation with a context. We're explaining the complexity of gender and sexual orientation and identity. It's actually in the actual practice, it's all up to the expression. That's why one of our participants said if one person showed up in is non-binary and looking like a man, they will be turned away. If they came in looking like a woman, they will be let in. So it's kind of confused for people to decide, people who's doing the intake process, the staff, to decide like who's gonna get access, who's not. And clearly, like if your organization have a policy about we do accept queer people and non-binary people in our facility, but what if this person showed up look like a a man, like what would you do? Sometimes it all goes back to the intake staff, depends on how this person gonna decide, and it's up to what this person trying to agree with or what they value. So this is all confusing, and it's causing so much confusion and problem in the actual process of guarantee who get the access or not.
Yeah, and it also complicates things. There's a lot of inconsistency. So while your policies might not actually say that trans people can come, depending on your own politics or the way you operate and your own understanding, you might, we called it flexible policy implementation, because some people who are doing intake understand, and they're just like, okay, like we see that you're non-binary, but we can finesse this to make sure that you can stay here. So we are seeing a lot of that, but how do we make it an official thing instead of practice that only some people are doing versus other? There needs to be consistency. And we also saw, as Viv mentioned, that those who are doing intake, all of the onus is on them. It's all about your personal decision making, and it can't be like that. It can't be based on the person's attitudes and perceptions of how they read gender to determine access. It can't be like that. So we need something different, and that something needs to be tangible to work from, so that people aren't stressed out about this because it's just not working the way that it's happening. So the barriers that were discussed in this project for engaging in talking about changes to mandates, policies, and procedures, we saw that fear, discomfort, and determining access are all barriers. So this is fear and discomfort around not understanding queer and trans identity. So it's not about the policies not being feasible. It's not about funding structures. The funders are going to fund you regardless, as long as you're helping people who are survivors of violence. And funders need to get on board with this as well, because like we are changing frameworks here. So we can't be scared and uncomfortable about making these decisions. We need to feel confident and sure about things. But it's really tricky to make decisions about something when it's based solely on gender presentation. So the point of using this image on this slide is that this is an image of folks who are representing non-binary identities. And when you look at these individuals, yes, they're cartoons, but you also can't tell what gender they identify with based on looking at them. So the whole point is we can't tell how masculine or feminine someone is or what their experience of violence is by looking at what they appear as, because I've had the experience as a cisgender woman previously in the sector where people have said, yeah, if you came here, you would be able to access services. And then slowly, as my voice has gotten deeper and I've looked more traditionally masculine, that answer has changed. So we see that gender presentation is like the main indicator of whether someone is granted access or not. So the pathway to change that seems to be to unpack our idea of gender. What does it mean to identify as something versus expressing as something? If I identify as a trans man, but I look like this and I'm kind of femme in some ways, and I like present that way, would I be included in a shelter because I benefit from being in a space like that? Because if I go to a shelter for men, then there's going to be high rates of violence against trans masculine people who are in those spaces too. So these are all things to consider. Another thing also that came out of this project is visibility in VAW agencies. So
yeah, a lot of staff pointed out that there's a homophobia. The homophobia is rampant amongst the women. It's not safe for me if it's not okay for the staff to be a lesbian, and it's not gonna be okay feel okay for the clients to be a lesbian. So this quote is coming from someone who's been working in the agency for so long, such a long time. But when the person who's working in the agency don't even feel safe to be a lesbian, how can the client to feel safe? This is all about the environment and the atmosphere within the agency. And to do that, a lot of staff, even when they are queer, they are non-binary, they are homosexual or whatever they identify with, they're trying to hide their identity by presenting themselves as a perfect hetero cisgender person, so people don't really questioning that, but it doesn't change their identity is actually queer or non-binary. It's just all about different presentation. But when we are having the staff, the queer staff don't feel safe to be visible in the organization, it's gonna be the same thing for the clients. You probably had so many non-binary or like people who are not cisgender, typical hetero clients already, but they present themselves in the way of people you will consider just like cisgender, hetero. They got access, but they are becoming invisible. How can we making invisible to be visible is a big challenge, and this is certainly a necessary step for your organization to having this change, to having the visibility of people who are queer and non-binary in your space, in your facility.
Mm-hmm. So the second quote also mirrors the same thing, saying having a right to come out or not to clients, but presently there's no conversation. I don't even know if I'm still the only queer one at the shelter. It's not a climate where anybody ever says. So this reiterates the point that Viv was talking about, and this is also further exemplified in this model that came up through our thematic analysis. And it shows that there's no visibility of queer or trans clients and also staff because it's not safe to be a gender or sexual minority in violence against women shelters. That's just the sentiment that we've gathered from across the data. And the pathway is what we talked about earlier, actually having that culture of inclusion and openness be authentic and organic rather than an afterthought. People can tell and people know whether people have a good sense of whether or not they feel like they can be open in a space, right? So in this model, you can see that having staff and clients are kind of two separate issues because we want to see staff who are queer, because when we don't see people that look like us or who identify similarly as us in organizations, it's really hard to want to seek support from there. Also, if you are a queer staff, we found that queer staff tend to, if they are open and out about their identity, the burden of responsibility in terms of doing queer and trans inclusion work tends to solely be on them. So across organizations, we mostly worked with individuals who are either queer or have politics or reason to be interested in queerness in some way. And they're the ones who find it important. So they're the ones doing all the work and nobody else is really on board with them. And it's someone who is desperately trying to create change because it's their own experience and they see the broader implications. And folks can't be doing this alone. Otherwise, the change is slow and painful. And when there's not a lot of change, people don't want to stick around. So we do see a lot of turnover in queer people working in these spaces. This obviously impacts the clients. Viv, do you want to do the client one?
Yeah, so for the client one, when this is super important when the organization, if you don't have the visibility of the queerness, and the reputation is not inclusive, the clients are now seem to like trying even to, why should I even show up in the facility if I don't even know are they gonna accept me or not? And then later you will have less clients actually who are queer actually seek for the supports from this organization, and it's all going back to even lower visibility and contributing to the reputation of inclusion again. So this is a cycle we have to break it out.
Totally. And then all of the factors that we talked about obviously impact direct service provision, but we wanted to highlight some of the key themes, sub-themes that came out of direct service provision. So generally, participants talked about not understanding queer, trans, two-spirit, non-binary realities. So whether it be not having enough training or education, because violence has generally been taught and understood in the framework of violence against women, folks don't have the baseline understanding of identity in terms of queer and transness, gender identity, expression, sexual orientation, and then also what violence, how violence operates and manifests in those communities. We see that gender inclusive language is a potential solution. This was highlighted across agencies because people's first step in doing this work seems to be like the pronoun thing. So folks have started talking about putting their pronouns in their email signatures, regardless if you use she, her, they, them pronouns or he, him pronouns, whatever. People have been starting to do that, but there's a desire for more gender inclusive work. Do you want to do physical space?
Yeah, and also like that will extend it to the physical space. Like it can be inside your facility anywhere. Is that gender or not? And the most important thing is actually the outreach and the partnership, because like you don't have to do it alone. Like everyone do have a limited resources and knowledge and all those things, but you don't have to do this alone. There's so many other organizations, but right now it seems like a lot of organizations they just trying to do everything by themselves. And how about just like reach out to our organization? You guys might not have the same like same mission, but you can share a lot of things like how to be inclusive in your services that are going to be super helpful and efficient in the future.
Totally. And just to add on to more about the direct service provision piece, we asked a question in our survey about the percent of individuals who've received training related to specific identity groups, because we know when people come in and do like an LGBT 101 training, some different topics might get covered. And we found that people receive the most training on the experiences of survivors who are women, whether that be cisgender or transgender identified women. And then the information, training materials related to non-binary individuals is under 30%, folks reported, and then barely any on queer cisgender men's experiences and transgender men's experiences. And of course, this makes sense given the framework of violence against women, but this is just obviously a snapshot of what potential training topics have looked like already when doing queer and trans inclusion in those spaces. So this shows that there's a need for more comprehensive understanding of how violence looks. Similarly, here's a quote that exemplifies what we were talking about earlier. This participant said, "We think that we know about patriarchy and violence and misogyny, but this is not how it is experienced by all people. And these are really hard conversations, but we need to have them." So people are aware that these patterns are happening and that violence is rooted in these forces, but it's hard to talk about it. And it is hard, but we know that these are in conversations that once we have the baseline language, then it becomes more comfortable to begin talking about it in a more careful way.
And then after we know, we are actually trying to move the whole facility, the whole organization to be more inclusive. Like that's sometimes can be challenging, like if you just trying to do something like put a rainbow flag, the pride flag, or the trans flag on your door, but clients actually experience the whole process by staying in the facility feeling shitty. That will not really contributing to the organization reputation and how the actual influence we have been done of the changing process. So the process has to be consistent about what we are trying to do and make it to be something tangible.
Totally. So this is our favorite part because we love a learning and growth moment. These are, we're framing it this way because we think that based on these findings that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but it could be fun. And we want to provide a few ideas of what a process of change could potentially look like.
So after we talk about all the gender and all the sexual orientation, all the complexity within the gender-based violence topic, by now we probably all agree that violence coming from the patriarchy, and woman is not the only identity who's being suffering from the violence, and this is all about different this is not really about like what kind of identity you have. Like this is all about violence. So it's all going back to the basic: who does your organization, your agency serve? So in your mandates, you might say that's woman, that's perfectly okay. But if you're trying to say adding the acronym into it, but how are you gonna actually making it to the process? Like, for example, the intake process, how are you making the mandate to the action, to the policy, and to the procedure, to the actual products?
Right, so we were thinking that the first step before we even think about what it means to be inclusive at your agency or our agency, you have to think about who do you serve, and who are you willing to serve? Most likely the answer right now is anyone who identifies as a woman, which is great, but we know that this is going to be really tricky when you have individuals who experience violence who might not identify as a woman, but might have similar experiences of how violence is operated, or how violence operates on yourself. That did not, I'm sorry. So then looking at who are you willing to serve, and then what is the language that we need to develop or learn in order to communicate that? So we need to identify what it is and then figure out how to say it. And processes of change look different across organizations, and it's a spectrum. We love a spectrum, of course, regardless if it's gender or change. But for this, you can do the work to change it so that you become inclusive for lesbian, bisexual, queer, and trans women identified survivors. So anyone who identifies as a woman, which is what most agencies are doing right now. But then there's the full other end of the spectrum where you can become fully integrated, gender integrated, and serve survivors of all genders and sexual orientations. And of course, there's lots of room in between or variations of this, because this is not going to look the same across agencies, but we're seeing really creative solutions already to this problem that exists in the sector, where folks are kind of looking at it and maybe saying, you know, maybe we should serve people who feel that they benefit from being in a space that's focused on women and trans people. Maybe we're only including people who experience violence based on being trans, non-binary, or a woman. You're allowed to define it however your agency wants to, but as long as you're using thoughtful language and having intention behind it, I feel like those are the key ingredients that helps us begin thinking about that.
And we all understand every organization, you might have certain limitation, regardless that's funding issue or perspectives of your founder, or just like in general, what actually can be done. Like that's totally okay. We all have limited resources, but this is also something you can envision with the time changing. So you can envision like within like 2 years, I want my organization at this point, but in 10 years, I might imagine my organization into this point. That's totally okay. And you don't have to make your organization to be all inclusive in the end. Like that's all absolutely fine. What is need to be happening is that you understand what actually who you want to serve and how you're going to determine the process to be.
Exactly. So we have a few recommendations based off of our findings, and yes, these look very vague. And we can't give you all the answers, of course, because unfortunately this process is totally specific to your agency. So we are seeing this as presenting a few ideas of the tools that you could utilize to kind of figure out where you want to go as an agency. And then you pick from your toolbox and make it work for you. So the first thing, as we talked about, is figuring out where you stand in terms of who you serve, how you serve them, and what does it currently look like in terms of LGBT inclusion at your workplace, so or your agency. In this project last year, the survey that we use is a really solid assessment. So if you're ever interested in like having a resource like that, please contact us. Other recommendations, Viv, do you want to go?
Yeah, like another thing is like tailor the training and education opportunities. Like another thing in the field, in the sector, everyone is trying to do all there's so many training, blah blah, another training, all those things. But sometimes the training needs to be tailored into your organization, what you guys actually needs to do, and sometimes it might need to be like super tangible and tailored into your own organization to make it actually to be something working in your organization. And going back to the mandates, the policy and procedure is super important as we keep talking about those things. Those are the framework, how we starting changing from there, from the framework to the tangible thing we're gonna do. And then creating a welcoming environment for all is super important. As we said, when there's no visibility of queer and trans people and folks who are experiencing violence, they don't have heard your reputation of being inclusive. They will not be getting close to the organization.
And one of the important pieces that we really wanted to stress, I feel like collaboration, outreach, and media, I feel like needs to just be the first and foremost sometimes, because with collaboration comes all of these opportunities for growth. And a lot of what we're seeing across the sector is that folks are contacting the same organizations over and over again. So specifically to Toronto, if there's one organization that is well known for doing queer and trans work, and that seems to be the only place that people are seeking support from. And there are other people doing this work. There are other organizations, other queer people, grassroots movements who are talking about violence, and it's about finding people and doing the creative work, collaborating with people in a way that is meaningful, that values their experiences, and that actually has goals towards change. And then everything else will fall into place. Even, I know that sounds very easy, but the other decisions are going to feel easy once you're working from a framework that everyone is comfortable with. And lastly, reflection and feedback. This is our favorite, of course, because as researchers, we love an evaluation, but reflecting on these processes of change and collecting evaluation information and data over time will be really, really helpful, because it helps track organizational change and development, what is working, what's not working, and even having those quick moments of feedback will help the process so that people feel involved and that people feel like they have buy-in and input in what's going on.
And this is a constantly changing process. Everyone can contribute into it. It doesn't mean like the goal in the beginning has to stay the same. Like during all the feedback and reflection session you have, you might have to like adjust your goal a little bit to make it work. Whatever is working for your organization is the best for your organization. There is no 100% right answer for everyone.
So sorry. So we're really grateful that everyone has sat through our webinar today. And this is an invitation to collaborate with us or contact us. Viv and I, actually, Viv, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, like we have been working on all those creative ways of creating new resources for everyone can be used in the future. And because personally, I'm a sex educator, 4 years ago, I already started my video channel to do sex education through internet, through social media. And right now, me and Ellis are trying to utilizing this way as a prevention for everybody, because everyone we know about how powerful social media can be. And all my research has been found out like social media is actually the new way for people to study about sexuality, about sexual health. And recently I'm working on my thesis right now to engage in conversation interviews with my participants about their experience in sexual health and sex education, how they want sex education to be done in terms of what they have been experiencing, what they think can be done earlier to prevent what the horrible thing they have been experienced. A lot of people, like everyone just keep mentioning about violence and sexual assault should be some part of the sex education, because this is a prevention way to tell people how you respect others, how you treat others with respect. And I see sex education is a fundamental start point of preventing all the violence in the future. So hopefully like we can keep working on this way and making more creative solution in the future, and everyone welcome to collaborating with us, and we are happy to do more possibility like in the future.
Yeah, and especially just to jump on that, in these unprecedented times, digital communication and trainings and education is our best friend. And Viv and I are kind of working from this model right now where we're trying to abolish the classic training in our work and try and come up with these quick and informal, very chill ways of explaining information that's accessible and clear and promotes discussion. So if you're interested in coming up with tools like that with us, we are more than happy to chat because that's the stuff we love. And here are our references as well, in case anyone wants to find some of the documents that we were talking about. The Open Minds, Open Doors article is the Quinn 2011 paper.
Thank you so much. I would like to say more, but there are so many questions and comments that, with your permission, just know that your presentation was so appreciated. It has generated a lot of thoughts, and I've invited my colleague, Diane Lalonde, to join us, and we're just going to take turns presenting comments or questions and invite you to respond. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. I'll start us off. Is patriarchy specifically tied to white men? Is the suggestion that patriarchy is a construct of the various European civilizations? How does patriarchy, power over, and colonization specifically unite into one?
Oh, that's so juicy.
Yeah.
You asked that. That was perfect.
Over to you, Ellis.
No, Viv, do you want to start?
You can start. You have so much to say about that.
I don't know. This is going to be the most oversimplification I'm going to say, but I'm going to say same, but diff. Like when I do critical masculinity studies too, and we see that, like whoever said that great comment question, patriarchy and colonization are intertwined. It is not just about the white man as like the full form of domination that we're talking about, but these patterns have, like through colonization, have progressed cross-culturally. So we see that this is beyond the North American context as well, but we're specifically just talking about this context for this project. Do you have anything to add, Bev?
No. Thank you. Diane?
So lots of people are really interested in the resources that you mentioned, some that are in their references and some that aren't. And so I guess a question/request might be if you're able to share links to those resources. Maybe it's something our team could help with, just collecting those. And I've been tracking all the requests that came in.
Yeah, that would be great. We have an unpublished project report from the project that we did last year, and I think that would be really helpful for folks, so we can try and figure out a way to make it look nicer and send it out. And then otherwise, contacting us through email is probably the best way if you want any tailored resources or talking about education opportunities with myself and Viv.
Okay. How is Canada's inclusion of gender identity and expression in Canadian human rights law in 2017 impacting violence against women's services? By law, don't VAW services need to make changes to their policies?
Oh yeah, that's such a juicy question. Sorry, I'm like so excited right now. Great question. Yeah, so 2017 is when Status of Women Canada decided to like make the change to women and gender equity. So what was Status of Women is now Wage, and Wage, our supervisor, Sian Wilson, shout out to Dr. Sian Wilson, is also working with Wage right now as well. And because of that, there's been such a call to diversify the gender-based violence services that are out there. So we're seeing so many more initiatives. We're seeing an LGBTQ capacity fund that was just launched. I think the due date is very soon. Specific to be doing gender-based violence work in queer organizations. So there's that side of it. So then the other piece is getting what we would call mainstream organizations or agencies to be doing that work as well. So it's a slow process, but that has really catalyzed a lot of change, I would say, the federal government switch.
Diane?
So I'll ask a question just around language. And so an individual is wondering, can you speak about gender inclusive language versus gender neutral language? I see the loss of a gendered lens with gender neutral language.
Oh, cool question. Yeah, I can only speak for myself and my perspective on this. I personally don't like using the word gender neutral language when I'm talking about it, because I think the gendered piece is important. And sometimes maybe when we're talking about gender-based violence, it's like the idea of taking gender away from it, but really we need to honor gender as the entry point into the conversation and understand, again, that piece that Viv really explained well of patriarchy. So gender inclusive, I don't know, I don't like using any of this terminology to talk about it. Viv, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, to add on that, I think the fundamental principle we're trying to do here is that to respect each other. So sometimes like people they want to claim their gender. Like for example, if you're talking to a transgender woman who going through a lot and trying to be a woman and embracing all the womanhood she has, and suddenly you call that woman they might be offended by that. So by the end of the day, like just asking that person whatever that person would like to be addressed and use that person's preferred language and everything's fine.
Oh, thank you. Good explanation.
You talked a little bit about this towards the end of your presentation, but one of our participants would like you just to speak a little more on your thoughts about setting up separate services and shelters for queer and trans people versus making women-centered shelters support queer and trans people.
Mm-hmm. And that's a really great question. I think that question has been asked a lot when I'm doing these trainings or talks generally, and also in the academic research. Actually, people are generally asking this question, and I see this as anyone who can get involved in this should be involved in this kind of work. So ending gender-based violence is everybody's responsibility. It doesn't matter what sector you're in. It doesn't matter where your money is coming from, in my opinion. We are all responsible in our own practice in everyday life and through our services to make sure that people are not harmed and that people are healing and getting what they need in order to get past experiences of violence and move forward. So to me, it doesn't matter. It's whoever is capable of doing the work and has the resources should be doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And also in our, like by the end of the presentation, we do present a spectrum of all different kind of destination one organization can be. So we do understand that every organization has their own concern and unlimited strengths of reach certain point, and that's absolutely fine. But also, like as Alice just said, every organization has a responsibility to take action to end violence, because by the end of the day, every organization we're all here is because we want to end violence. It's not about gender.
Thank you. Diane?
A few questions have come in with people wondering if you've done any work around youth. So any recommendations in improving pathways there? And one specific one asked if you have any suggestions to effectively change frameworks within a Catholic organization responsible for child welfare work.
That's really juicy.
Viv, do you want to speak to the youth?
Okay, so we actually do a lot of work with youth, and my sex education is all around youth sex education for sure, mainly. And we definitely, like, there's so many different things we can do for youth, and the most basic thing, like going back to prevention. And this is still early in one's life, like we're talking about the youth, which is like our next generation. Definitely focus on prevention is a way to end violence in the future.
Yeah. And
we cannot address the importance of prevention action even more there. And Alice, do you want to add on?
No, like what Viv is saying is like 100% what we think. And we both are in a place where we've been doing a lot of work in terms of understanding access to services, service access, reactive solutions to violence. And we're really interested in moving forward and doing more prevention, health promotion. So we like the idea of doing healthy relationship promotion, and through Springtide Resources, there were some really crucial programs that did that. And I can share different resources with folks if you'd like in that area. And we're also connected to people doing work with boys and men and young men who are on that end of prevention. And there's some really awesome initiatives happening across Canada. So we're also happy to share that.
When you talk about the spectrum, one of the participants supports inclusive policy and is excited by the whole presentation, but wonders if you've heard much about or given thought to when it's difficult to provide safety towards an individual who might use a service or seek shelter when other residents aren't as accepting of that individual.
And that's a really awesome question. It's come up at every shelter that at least I've been to in talking about this. And that's kind of where your own organization and your comfort in navigating these dynamics comes into play, because it's all about complexity. And a lot of these situations tend to be what happens if someone who looks like a man comes into the space and the women are triggered. Like, that is still under the assumption of heteronormative violence. So for example, if I went into a space, I would more likely like experience some sort of trigger from being around like potentially cis women or something. Like, let's say that's my experience. So it's possible to have other kinds of for residents or service users to have different experiences. So it's about being able to handle hold the trauma and work through that and focus on the pieces that are tangible, and doing those little informal education pieces within your agency. So with some of the agencies I'm working with right now, we're talking about even making little videos that help facilitate discussions. So if something does happen, you can pull out the clip and be like, oh, here, like one of the child and youth workers suggested at a place, pulling out the video and talking about it, facilitating a discussion, and just having those resources on hand.
Thank you. Diane?
So lots of individuals were interested in how you collaborated with others and some of the opportunities that were there and maybe some of the challenges that you faced in doing so.
So in working, I can speak to collaborating with violence against women agencies. It's of course difficult because nonprofit sector, like things going on all the time, different funding deadlines. So of course all of the drama related to that stuff. But otherwise it's just making sure that everything is going smoothly in terms of project management. And our advisory committee, there was a separate kind of paper written on that because we saw that there was a lot of involvement at first, but then that trickled down and folks stopped coming after a while, and it ended up being close to 4 at the end. So that made me rethink the idea of advisory committees and how to actually create one, or opportunities for collaboration and involvement that are more intentional based on what people actually want. So it got Viv and I thinking about all of these opportunities for like mentorship opportunities and getting other people involved in research, but we need, of course, funding and more opportunities to do that.
I think this, even though there are more questions, I think this has to be our last one. The comment was that a lot of First Nations cultures didn't identify or allow any 2SLGBTQ+ in their communities. Some are still not accepting, negative towards, and sometimes violent towards. How do we support individuals who are already living in tense and heavily white hatred mindsets?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. So there's like several layers, and I feel like some of it, based on the question, it's like some of it is potentially like the repercussions of, or not the, all that's involved in being in a colonial context and what that means has potentially shaped values that, or exclusion happens because of the context. So in those situations, it's so important. I don't know like who's asking the question, if it's someone from an agency that's specifically an Indigenous agency, whatever, but I would try and look for resources or contact people specific to your area, or even just reach out to us because we might know someone who would be good to talk to and find specific resources. But I find that I don't know if it's cited here, but I can send it out, the family aftercare tool report that I was talking about earlier. It has a really strong Indigenous focus. It's written by and for, so I feel like that could potentially be helpful as well.
Thank you. We just want to thank you, Viv, Ellis, for an amazing presentation. You are both marvelous communicators. There were so many comments about the style that you used in communicating to all of us, and it was really appreciated. And as the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub, We're grateful that you made the time to come and share your knowledge and learning journey with all of us and to help us on ours. So we wish you well, and hopefully we'll have a chance to work together again.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. We really appreciate it, and we had a lot of fun.
Great. Thank you. Stay safe.
You too.
Stay
Bye,
safe.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.